This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
I've been asked to speak today on the subject of my book, In Retrospect, the subtitle of which is The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. And I don't have to tell you that the book has caused immense, I was going to say controversy, perhaps discussion is a less polemical term, immense discussion. It's raised a host of questions. I want to focus in my opening remarks on 4 of those, and then during the question period, I can address those that you wish to put particular emphasis on. The 4 that I'll begin to discuss are: first, why after a silence of 30 years have I now chosen to address the subject? And secondly, with hindsight, did the U.S. activities in Indochina, Vietnam in particular, contribute to the security of the West as we who were responsible for them believed they did at the time, or were they a costly failure? And thirdly, if they were a failure, how can one account for the errors of judgment that caused it? And finally, most importantly, are there lessons which can be drawn from the Vietnam experience, which the U.S. and the world can apply to avoid repetitions of similar tragedies in the 21st century? So first, why now? There's several reasons why I've chosen to speak out on Vietnam. The most compelling one I state in the preface, and there I write, we of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations who participated in the decisions on Vietnam acted according to what we thought were the principles and values of this nation. We made our decisions in the light of those values. And yet today, with hindsight, I believe we were wrong, terribly wrong. And therefore, I believe that we owe it to future generations to explain why. So that's the major reason I'm speaking out now. But another factor has also greatly influenced my decision, and this may appear to be a digression to discuss it, but it is important to me, and it did influence the writing of the book. In recent years, I've come to understand how examinations of past confrontations between nations and among nations, particularly with respect to conflict, can help avoid conflict in the future. And this lesson was brought out to me in particular by 5 extraordinary meetings that participants in the Cuban Missile Crisis, participants from the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the U.S. held during the 5 years 1987 to 1992. I think it's generally recognized now that our 3 nations, the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the U.S., came very close to nuclear war during that period, much, much closer than I think most of you in this room understand, and we should perhaps discuss that as well in the question period. None of the leaders of those nations intended that would be the result of their actions. Our meetings with the Cubans and the Soviets, therefore, with their leaders, Castro, Gromyko, for a long period of time was the foreign minister and later the deputy prime minister, Dobrynin, the longtime ambassador to the U.S., senior military officials of both Cuba and the Soviet Union. Our meetings were focusing, therefore, on the misunderstandings, misjudgments, miscalculations, the lessons that we could draw from the near confrontation with disaster. And I think these retrospective reviews can indeed provide guidance on how to avoid and better manage similar confrontations in the future. If you haven't read it, I would urge you to consult the transcripts and the published materials on those meetings. I very much hope that my book, In Retrospect, will do the same with respect to the Vietnam conflict. I've suggested to the Council on Foreign Relations that we should probe the degree to which the Vietnamese today would be willing to engage in discussions similar to those we carried out with the Soviets and Cubans to try to draw similar lessons. Another digression. Because the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on several occasions during the 7 years I was associated with operations in Vietnam, because they on several occasions referred to the use of nuclear weapons, and because nuclear weapons remain in our arsenal today, and their use remains an important part of our contingency war plans, I've dealt with the risk of nuclear war in an appendix to the book. If you buy the book, please read the appendix. Normally we don't. This is very important. The risk of nuclear war today is far greater than I think most people in the room realize. It is, of course, low, but it's the low risk of utter catastrophe, and it's far greater than we should accept. That's the message in the appendix. I suggest ways of reducing it. Here, I don't want to say any more on the risk of nuclear war, the experience we've had with nuclear weapons, other than to repeat what I said a moment ago, that we still, most of us, don't understand the degree of risk we faced 33 years ago during the missile crisis. It's only recently that we've come to see the extent of that risk. 2 years ago, the Soviets published remarkable articles in the Moscow press. They were written by senior military officials of the Soviet Union who had participated in the missile crisis. And they reported that at the height of the crisis, at a time when the CIA said there were no nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba, there were actually 162 there, including about 100 tactical weapons. And moreover, at the particular moment of greatest crisis, Thursday, October 25th, 1962, the Soviet commander in Cuba, General Plyov, instructed his officers to move nuclear warheads from their storage sites closer to the launch vehicles in anticipation of what they believed would be a U.S. attack within 48 to 72 hours. And Plyov at that time sent a cable to the Soviet Defense Minister Malinovsky informing him of that action, the movement of the warheads closer to the launch vehicles. Malinovsky sent it into Khrushchev. Khrushchev scrawled approved across and sent it back to Malinovsky. Now, had not Khrushchev on Sunday, 2 days after the cable was sent, Sunday the 28th of October, had not Khrushchev on that day announced their withdrawal, almost certainly on the following day, Monday the 29th, the majority of President Kennedy's military and civilian advisors would have recommended him that he launch the attack for which contingency plans had been developed, launch the attack on Cuba. The first day's airstrike was planned for 1,080 sorties. That would have been a huge strike. It was to be followed immediately by a sea and land invasion, which included 180,000 combat troops. The entire operation was to be commanded by Cinque Lant, the commander of all U.S. forces in the Atlantic, Admiral Dennison. Admiral Dennison had asked the President and me to authorize that his troops be equipped with nuclear warheads. We'd refused that request because, as I've said, the CIA at the time reported there were no nuclear warheads in Cuba. But nobody should believe that had U.S. troops been confronted by nuclear weapons in Cuba, that we would not have responded. They would not have had warheads with them, but we would have launched aircraft and warheads from the southeastern U.S. Where would it have ended? In utter disaster. We came that close. And that risk you're living with today. Please read the appendix to understand the extent of it and the kind of actions we can take to reduce it. Now let me turn back to Vietnam and to the second question. With hindsight, did U.S. actions in Indochina contribute to the security of the West, or were they a costly failure? For me, my involvement in Vietnam began, or I should say ended the day after I left the Pentagon, and that was February 28, 1968. At that time, U.S. fatalities totaled 17,000. But the war didn't end for the U.S. until 5 years later, and by that time the fatalities had increased to 58,000. In addition, and we shouldn't forget this, 3,200,000 Vietnamese died. This figure was released only 3 or 4 weeks ago by Hanoi, which had been carrying on an extended study of it. I'm not at all sure that it includes the fatalities of the South Vietnamese military. I think it probably does not. So almost surely the total would be greater than that. But it's a tremendous number. And we and they together were responsible for that, and we shouldn't forget it. More than that, by the end of the war, our economy had been damaged by years of improperly financed wartime expenditures. And the political unity of our society had been shattered. It wasn't to be restored for decades. Now, were such high costs justified? Dean Rusk, whom I loved and admired, a great patriot in peace and war. Dean Rusk died December 20th of last year. Until the day he died, he believed, yes, indeed, the intervention was justified. And the costs, while high, were a necessary cost of protecting this nation. He wasn't alone. He isn't alone. There are others who believe that to this day. Walt Rostow, President Johnson's national security advisor, whom I was with a week or two ago, believes that. Lee Kuan Yew, the great Prime Minister of Singapore, believes it. And they conclude that without U.S. intervention in Vietnam, that communist hegemony, both Soviet and Chinese, would have spread further through South and East Asia to include control of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and perhaps India. And some would go further and say that, emboldened by that extension of the communist sphere of influence, that the Soviet Union would have taken greater risks to bring additional pressure to bear against Western Europe and against the United States, and perhaps would have gone so far as to seek to control the oil fields of the Middle East. Now, I don't share those judgments. The danger of communist aggression during the 4 decades of the Cold War, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was indeed real. And perhaps we should talk some about that. As I mentioned, we in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations came very, very close to war with the Soviet Union on 3 occasions. They sought to take West Berlin in August of 1981. The Supreme Allied Commander in Europe at that time, General Larry Norstad, told me that under certain circumstances we'd have to use nuclear weapons to respond to that pressure. We avoided it. We came close. And a year later, as I've suggested, there was a near nuclear war over Cuba. In June of 1967, the Soviets backed Egypt in their stated attempt to wipe Israel off the map. It was the first time the hotline was used. The tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union became so great. The message that Kosygin sent to Johnson over the hotline said, if you want war, you'll get it. In any event, we avoided war on those 3 occasions. But they illustrate the point I make, that the danger to the West during those 4 decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was real. And to have failed to defend ourselves against it would have been foolhardy and irresponsible. But that said, I question today whether Soviet or Chinese influence in the 70s and 80s would have been greater, would have more seriously endangered our nation or the nations of the West, had we never entered Vietnam with combat forces, or had we withdrawn on any one of several occasions between 1963 and 1973. And moreover, by the early 1960s, or early mid-1960s, it should have been apparent to American leaders that the 2 conditions which underlay President Kennedy's initial movement of U.S. military personnel into Vietnam as advisors, by the time he died, there were 16,000 there. The 2 conditions that underlay his decisions to undertake that action were not being met. Political stability, which he thought was absolutely essential to effective operation of U.S. military in Vietnam, was not being maintained. And he had said over and over again that the war was a South Vietnamese war, it could only be won by South Vietnamese troops, and it was clear that that condition was not being met. Now, given those facts, and they are indeed facts, I believe today that we could and should have withdrawn from Vietnam on any one of several occasions between 1963 and 73. With hindsight, I don't believe that U.S. withdrawal at any one of those times, if it had been properly explained to the American people and properly explained to our allies, I don't believe that U.S. withdrawal on any one of those occasions would have led West Europeans to question our guarantees of their security through NATO, or would have led the Japanese to question the credibility of our guarantee of their security. But we didn't withdraw. Now, why didn't we? My associates in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations were indeed an exceptional group of individuals. They were highly intelligent, they were well educated, they were hardworking, they were dedicated servants of the nation and our people. Now, how did this group, pejoratively termed the best and the brightest, how did this group go wrong? What lessons can we draw from that experience? Lessons which I believe will be applicable to today and tomorrow. That's the story I tell. And the story begins the day after President Kennedy's inauguration, when I and my 9 cabinet colleagues were sworn in as cabinet members by Chief Justice Warren. I was then the 8th and the youngest ever, and ultimately to be the longest serving Secretary of Defense. As I said, I was immensely proud to have been appointed to that office. But at the same time, at the moment of swearing in, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of foreboding. Because 2 days before, on January 19, which was President Eisenhower's last full day in office, President Eisenhower and President Kennedy had met along with their senior cabinet members, the Secretaries of Treasury, State, and Defense of each administration, and President Eisenhower's military assistant and a civilian associate of President Kennedy, Clark Clifford. And we met for the purpose of hearing from General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, his views on the major problems that we would face. And we covered an immense number of subjects that afternoon, but the emphasis was on Indochina. And several of the participants, including me, following the meeting, prepared memorandum for the record. And these and subsequent memoirs of the meeting present quite different views of what Eisenhower advised Kennedy about the crucial issue of U.S. military intervention in Southeast Asia. Eisenhower's focus during the discussion was largely on Laos rather than Vietnam. Laos was the most crucial problem at that time. Here's what Clark Clifford wrote of the meeting, and I quote his words. President Eisenhower stated Laos is the present key to the entire area of Southeast Asia. If Laos were lost to the communists, it would bring an unbelievable pressure to bear on Thailand, Cambodia, South Vietnam. And he concluded, therefore, that, in his opinion, Laos was of such importance that if it reached the state where we could not persuade others to act with us, then he would be willing, as a last desperate hope, to see the U.S. intervene militarily alone. Dean Rusk remembered the meeting largely as Clark Clifford's note reported it. But my memorandum, which I prepared at President Kennedy's request based on notes I'd taken at the meeting, suggested Eisenhower was actually giving a very different message, a mixed message. I had the impression he was deeply uncertain about the proper course. And I wrote, President Eisenhower advised against unilateral military action by the United States. I did note that he ended by saying that if Laos is lost to the free world, in the long run we'll lose all of Southeast Asia. Doug Dillon, President Kennedy's Secretary of the Treasury, told a scholar that his memory and his recollection of the meeting jibed with mine, and he went further and said it was his impression that Eisenhower and Herter, his Eisenhower Secretary of State, got a certain inner satisfaction from laying a potentially intractable problem in Kennedy's lap. Now, I think Doug's impression was absolutely correct. Eisenhower didn't know what to do in Southeast Asia, and he was indeed glad to leave it to the Democrats. But I can't fault him for handing us a problem with no solution. because the Indochina problem was intractable the way both the Republicans and the Democrats at the time were defining it. And just how intractable it was, we would learn to our sorrow during the following 10 years. I think there's other evidence that Eisenhower was stumped at the time. 3 weeks before our meeting, we learned later, he had said to his people, and this is in the record, quote, "We must not allow Laos to fall to the communists, even if it involves war," unquote. But that statement, of course, contrasts starkly with his actions some 6 years earlier when he stood aside at the time of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Now, perhaps he'd changed his views in those intervening 6 years, but I can't reconcile the two. Would Eisenhower ultimately have gone to war as we did in Vietnam? I don't know. I think it's an irrelevant question. The decision wasn't his, it was ours, and we were wrong. Now, to demonstrate how and why we were wrong, I review in detail the key decisions we made during the 7 years I was secretary. The pros and cons of alternatives, the views of the different participants in the decision-making process, and the action that resulted. And it's from that review that I identify our failures and draw from them the lessons which I believe will be applicable to today and tomorrow. The last chapter of the book focuses on the lessons. I'm going to condense it very, very quickly and, in a sense, very superficially, just to put before you my final conclusions. And we, if you wish, we can go into any one or all of these further during the discussion period. There were, I think, 11 major causes for the disaster, or our disaster in Vietnam. First, we misjudged then, and I think we're continuing to misjudge, the geopolitical intentions of our adversaries, in that case, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, China, and the Soviet Union. And we vastly exaggerated, not intentionally, perhaps exaggerated is the wrong word, we vastly overestimated the dangers to the United States of the actions of our adversaries. Secondly, we viewed the people and leaders of South Vietnam in terms of our own experience. We saw in them a thirst for and a determination to fight for freedom and democracy. And I think we totally misjudged the political forces that work in that society. Thirdly, we underestimated the power of nationalism to motivate a people, in that case, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, to motivate a people to fight and die for their cause. I think we're continuing to underestimate the power of nationalism in various parts of the world. We can talk more of that if you wish. Fourthly, our misjudgments of friend and foe alike reflected our profound ignorance of the history, the culture, the politics of the countries we were dealing with, and the personalities and habits of their leaders. We might have made similar misjudgments on those 3 occasions I mentioned to you when we came very close to war with the Soviet Union, had we not had at our elbow 3 individuals, Tommy Thompson, Chip Bolin, George Kennan, who throughout their life had studied the history, culture, politics, and the personalities of the leaders of the Soviet Union. They were the heroes of our successful avoidance of war with the Soviet Union during those 7 years. We had no counterparts with respect to Southeast Asia. Fifth, we failed then, as we have since, to recognize, and we're doing this today in several places, we failed then, as we have since, to recognize the limitations of modern, high-technology, military doctrine, equipment, to deal with highly motivated people's movements. Sixth, and this perhaps was the most important single failure, I'm not sure we've yet learned the lesson that can be derived from it. We failed to draw Congress and the American people into a full and frank discussion and debate of the pros and cons of a large-scale U.S. military involvement in Southeast Asia. We failed to do that before we initiated the action. It wasn't that we didn't have formal authority. We did. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed by the Senate in August 1964 says without any qualification, the President, under this resolution, has authority to take the United States to war in China, in Indochina, in Southeast Asia. The problem wasn't with the formalities The problem was the substance. Neither the Congress nor the President intended that those words would be used as we used them. We should have gone back. We talked of it. We discussed it with the majority leader and the minority leader of the Senate. The majority leader was Senator Mansfield, a dove. The minority leader was Senator Dirksen, a hawk. They said, for God's sakes, don't reopen that question. It'll tear us apart. And it would have. But that's the price we must pay in this society if we expect the people to be united behind military action that we're engaged in. We didn't do that then. I said to you that I don't think we've learned the lesson yet. Before the Gulf War, a senior official of the government said the President had no need to go to the Congress for authority to initiate the action in the Gulf. The Constitution gave him power as Commander-in-Chief to take the nation to war. I was asked to testify on that point. Senator Sarbanes said, surely, Mr. Secretary, you disagree with that. It's contrary to the Constitution. I said, look, Senator, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. But he said, you'll answer it. I said, I won't answer it. I certainly won't answer it on a legal basis. He said, I demand that you do. He said, I'm totally unqualified to. I said, I'll tell you something. It's not a legal question. We shouldn't think of it as a legal question. It's a political question. This nation should never be taken to war by a president without the authority of the people as acted upon in the Congress. That's the issue. And I said, I don't believe President Bush would. He didn't. It was a pretty narrow decision, as a matter of fact. But he ultimately didn't. He didn't, we did, he was right and we were wrong. So I suggest that's one of the most fundamental lessons. I'm not sure we've learned it yet. Seventh, after the action got underway in Indochina, and unanticipated events forced us off our planned course because we hadn't debated the issues fully with the American people. They weren't prepared for the changes that had to be made. They didn't support many of the actions that would have been required to minimize the casualties and ultimately withdraw at a much lower cost. A nation's deepest strength lies not in its military force, and we sometimes forget this. It lies not in its military force, but in the unity of its people, and we didn't maintain that. Eighth, we didn't recognize that neither our people nor our leaders are omniscient. I'm not sure we recognize that today. Where our own security is not directly at stake, because we're not omniscient, we should never act unilaterally, militarily. We should insist that the decision for the U.S. to be involved militarily, in these cases where our own security, narrowly defined, is not directly at stake, we should insist these actions be debated fully with our allies and with other nations with similar interests. We didn't do that in Vietnam. Ninth, we didn't hold to the principle that U.S. military action, other than in response, direct response to our attack on our own security, should never be unilateral. We came very close to acting unilaterally in connection with in the Gulf. Had the casualty estimates of the Joint Chiefs of Staff turned into fact, there would have been a huge blood loss there. 90% of the blood loss would have been ours. There's no excuse for the U.S. acting as policemen of the world. There's no excuse for us accepting those risks. And yet today, our defense strategy, our defense forces, our defense budget is based on the stated premise that we will act alone in dealing with major conflicts across the world. I don't think we've yet learned the lesson I just pointed to. 10th, we failed to recognize that in international affairs, as in other aspects of life, at times there are problems which have no solutions. That's particularly hard for me to say. My life has been spent identifying problems, developing solutions to them. I'm prepared to say today there's some problems at some times that have no solutions, particularly not military solutions. I'm not at all sure we've learned that. There are many today who say we should intervene militarily in Bosnia. To do so today, I think, would be a disaster. We're going to have to learn at times to live with an imperfect, untidy world. And finally, 11th, Underlying many of these errors lay our failure to organize the top echelons of the government to deal effectively with the wide range of problems we were facing, ranging from cities burning in this country to racial unrest, economic issues of tremendous complexity, to global conflict across the globe. We didn't organize ourselves to deal with it. We did organize very effectively to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that's one of the reasons we succeeded. It, of course, was quite a different crisis. It extended over a very short period of time. It was very simple in concept. The alternatives were few. But we devoted 100% of our time to that and nothing else during the period. And I think that was one of the major reasons we were successful. During the Vietnam period, there wasn't a single senior person focusing solely on Vietnam at any time in the 7 years I was associated with it. We didn't have what Churchill called a war cabinet. We should have. So these were our major failures. And I believe that pointing them out today will allow us to map the lessons of Vietnam and place us in a position to apply them to the post-Cold War world. And I want to say one word about the post-Cold War world, the world of the 21st century, before I conclude. But before I get to that, let me digress a moment to say a few words about my feelings toward the two presidents with whom I worked. I expand on these somewhat more in the book. Of course, the first point to make is that neither was perfect. But I admired both immensely, with a deep feeling of respect and affection. Despite the stress and tension of 12 and 14-hour days, 7 days a week, addressing these crises domestically and across the globe, I think this extraordinarily warm and affectionate relationship that existed between me and the two presidents was common among all of the senior members of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. I think it's unique, if you think about this, that you don't find any books that I'm aware of written by members of these administrations criticizing the others and tearing them apart personally. And if you look at subsequent administrations, I think you'll find that is unique. Now, one word about Kennedy. He was a practical politician. And sometimes the political practices, particularly of his subordinates, took nasty forms. And I relate one or two instances of that kind in the book. But of far greater long-term importance, Kennedy was a leader. He had uncommon charisma, and he had an enormous ability to inspire. He moved the young and the old, both at home and abroad. And in this imperfect world, he raised our sights to the stars. And I think that legacy endures. For years after his death, as president of the World Bank, Marg, my wife, and I traveled to distant corners of the earth, villages that rarely, if ever, seen an American. And frequently we'd find tacked on to the thatch of a hut, torn out dog-eared photograph of President Kennedy torn out in some newspaper. It was one of the owner's most prized possessions. I think people do need heroes, and they certainly found one in Kennedy. Now, Johnson was totally different. You won't believe this, but yesterday I spoke in Los Angeles to a huge audience, and one of the members took me aside and said he for years wanted to put a question to me, and he expected an answer. And he said, in all seriousness, don't you believe that Lyndon Johnson was mentally deranged? Well, the answer is I don't believe that. But he was indeed a towering, powerful, paradoxical figure. And he reminded me, and I think often of this, he reminded me of a verse from Walt Whitman. You may recall it. I think it was from Whitman's Song of Myself. And Whitman wrote, do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I'm large. I contain multitudes. Now, that was Lyndon Johnson. And in the end, the tension between us, between two men who loved and respected each other, the tension between us grew so strong that it reached the breaking point. And we parted. And to this day, I don't know whether I quit or was fired. And I made that statement in Kay Graham's home. She had a large party about 10 days or 2 weeks ago, and I made that statement. And she interrupted me and said, "Bob, there isn't a person in this room that believes that." I said, "Of course you were fired." Well, I said, "Kay, you're just totally wrong. There's one person that believes it, and that's me." Well, she said, "You were fired." Now, I don't think it's really important, but it's a rather amusing incident, and what it shows is the degree of tension that existed. And this was an important point, and if you buy the book and read it, I think it's important to understand the views of each of us as it related to our involvement in Vietnam and what each were trying to do and why we ultimately parted. I must say this before I go on, that if the president had wanted to fire me, he would have done it exactly the way he did, and I would never have known whether I was fired or quit. Now, what I do know, however, is that when President Johnson awarded me the Medal of Freedom on my last day in office, at a glittering ceremony in the East Room of the White House, attended by the diplomatic corps, the Supreme Court justices, the leaders of Congress, press, family, friends, and so on, I was absolutely overwhelmed by the praise he directed at me, and I was totally unable to respond. I think that had I been able to do so, this is what I might have said. Today I end 1,558 days of the most intimate association with the most complex individual I've ever known. Many in this room believe Lyndon Johnson is crude, mean, vindictive, scheming, untruthful. Perhaps at times he's shown each of those characteristics. But he's much, much more. And I believe that in the decades ahead, history will judge him to have done more. For example, through the Civil Rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, the Great Society legislation. History will judge him to have done more, to alert us all to our responsibility toward the poor, the disadvantaged, and the victims of racial prejudice than any other political leader of our time. Had it not been for Vietnam, a war which he inherited, and which admittedly neither he nor we managed wisely, we would have been much further along in solving those problems. And I believe that then, and I believe it today. Now, in conclusion, as I said, I want to refer briefly to the future in relation to the past. My earliest memories are of a city exploding with joy. The date was November 11, 1918. It was Armistice Day. I was 2 years old. The city was San Francisco. And the people were celebrating not just the end of World War I, which of course we had won, but they were celebrating the belief of many of them, at least, the belief of President Woodrow Wilson, that we'd won a war to end all wars. But how wrong we were. This city, this century, the 20th century, will go down in history as the bloodiest century in human history. The human race, if you can call them human, will have killed 160 million people. 160 million people. But now, as this bloody century comes to a close, don't we have the opportunity to look ahead to something else? The Cold War has ended. George Kennan, on his 90th birthday a year or two ago, at a celebration we gave for him at the Council on Foreign Relations, George said he didn't believe there would be war among great powers anytime soon. And by soon, what did he mean? Well, perhaps 20 to 30 years. And I very much share that view. The Cold War has ended. I don't think there's a great likelihood of war between the great powers soon. Moreover, we do have the lessons of Vietnam before us. They can be learned, they can be applied. We should see much more clearly the risks of nuclear war. We can reduce those in ways as I've suggested in the appendix. We have a much better understanding, although we don't seem willing to apply it, of the capabilities of multilateral institutions, particularly the United Nations. A much greater understanding of the capabilities of the United Nations to prevent conflict, and where conflict develops, to end it. So don't we have reason to view the future with much greater hope? Don't we have reason to establish as our objective, the objective of this nation, that we will not permit the killing of another 160 million people in the 21st century? Now, many of you will think that so naive, so simplistic, so idealistic as to be quixotic. But we are a great nation. We're the most powerful nation in the world today. We'll continue. By the way, we've got terrible domestic problems. I'm well aware of that. But even in spite of those, we are the greatest nation in the world, the most powerful nation in the world. We will continue to be the most powerful nation in the world for decades to come. Don't we have both the responsibility and the capability to prevent the 21st century from being a repetition of the 20th? Can we be at peace with ourselves if we strive for less than that? I don't think so. And I hope you will agree. Thank you.
What event or what information changed your perception of the morality of the Vietnam War?
Well, I don't want to talk about the morality of the war. That wasn't what changed. I think morality as an issue should be considered far more than we consider it in relation to foreign policy and the application of military force. There are many who say there's no room for morality in connection with foreign policy and military operations. I don't believe that. And if you just take this nuclear problem for a moment, just think of the morality of that. Suppose we used our, well, whatever we have today, 10,000 strategic warheads. Suppose we use them. We must, if we have them, we must contemplate use under some circumstances. Now suppose we use them. What would happen? Well, we'd destroy whomever we targeted them on. And of course, the presumption would be that we were targeting them on somebody who had them, and they'd target theirs on us. Neither one of us could defend ourselves against the other. So they'd destroy us. But and there's a major moral issue there, I would think. But put that aside for the minute. What would happen to the rest of the world? You know, you're all concerned about Chernobyl. My God, that was a leak of nothing. And look what happened as a result of it. What do you think would happen to the rest of the world if Russia and we exchanged a part of our existing arsenals? We'd kill millions, tens of millions of human beings that weren't part of the conflict. What's the morality of that? I remember the first time, it was early in 1961, I went to the Strategic Air Command in Omaha. And I went over what's called the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operation Plan, which was our plan for using nuclear weapons. I couldn't believe it. We would have killed non-combatants in nations other than the Soviet Union and the US by the millions. What's the morality of that? Now, we've been living with that for years. We're living with it today. So the morality of the application of military power in many, many forms. I've chosen the easiest one to talk about, nuclear, but I can apply it with large firepower. What's the morality of using napalm? What was the morality? I was on Guam in March of 1945. There in temporary duty one night, and I sat in on the interrogation of our B-29 crews. I was part of the 20th Air Force, B-29s. Interrogation of the crews when they came back from raid on Tokyo. We had killed 100,000 civilians that night. That's more, I think, than the direct fatalities that resulted from the dropping of the bomb 50 years ago in Hiroshima. What was the morality of that? In the case of Vietnam, there are moral issues by the score. And we tend to overlook those. I think as we look ahead, we should pay far more attention to them.
Thank you. I want simply to testify as a trained nuclear scientist that you are absolutely correct in your statements about the the effect on civilians in other countries.
And therefore, I must be correct about the morality.
I agree with you about that also. The next one, please comment on the use of the U.S. military for humanitarian missions such as Somalia and Haiti.
Well, I think where the military is capable of carrying out a humanitarian mission, as I think perhaps it did in Haiti, it's appropriate to use it. In the case of Somalia, I think it was incapable of carrying out the mission, at least the mission assigned to it. I, for one, would have no objection to our military being trained to carry out such missions. I think we lucked out on Haiti. It would have been a bloody battle had not President Carter intervened, and thank God he did. But that wasn't our initial intention, and I would have seriously questioned whether we should have used the military had he not intervened. Perhaps we should limit to 2 more questions.
Yes, I was looking, I must confess, at this pack with some dismay. I think we had better, or no one will get home tonight. Did you consider the effect your book might have on Vietnam veterans?
Yes, and if you're a Vietnam veteran, particularly if you're a relative of one who died, what would you think the nation should do in relation to that loss? I would think that you would feel the most important thing that could be done would be to ensure that that veteran's son and daughter, or sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters, would never have to face a similar tragedy. So that's what the book is oriented to try to prevent in the future the tragedy that occurred in the past. Thank you. What I want to emphasize, and leave me out of this group, but what I want to emphasize is these were not evil people. Dean Rusk didn't intend to kill people for no gain to the peace of the world. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson didn't intend to do that. The military chiefs didn't intend to do that. Errors were made. I made errors. I certainly didn't intend to kill people other than to advance the peace of the world. We had fought, as I said, Dean and President Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs and I had fought 3, 4, 5 years in World War II. And at the end of that, you may not recall, but Churchill said, we lost millions. We, the U.S., France, Britain, lost millions of men because we appeased Hitler, because we didn't stop him early enough. We thought we were stopping China and the Soviet Union and preventing the loss of millions. We were wrong. You've got to read. I know it's on page 295 because I was so startled. A private memorandum, I didn't even see it. Dean and I were as close as brothers. I didn't even see that memo that he sent President Johnson until my researcher dug it out of the Johnson Library a few months ago when I was writing the text. Dean said, if we don't continue to do what we're doing in Vietnam, we will bring on World War III and we'll lose millions. And that's what he believed. We were wrong. And I think what we owe to the veterans, particularly to the relatives of those who died, is assurance that we're learning those lessons, we're going to apply them for the future, and as I suggest, their sons, daughters, grandsons, and granddaughters will not face the same tragedy. Now, one further point on the healing process. There isn't any veteran to whom we owe more, in a sense of obligation, than Ron Kovich, paraplegic, lost both legs, the author of Born on the 4th of July. And he said the other day, I think I have it here, let me just find it and I'll read it to you. Yeah, he said the other day, over the long run, McNamara's book and his comments will promote healing. As Americans, we must all embrace McNamara. Colonel Hackworth, who is the most decorated living Vietnam veteran, 101 medals, 4 times wounded in Vietnam, ended an article in Newsweek 2 weeks ago by saying, McNamara's book is an important step toward understanding what happened so as to avoid repetition. That's the first objective I had. And he goes on to say, and it may help some of the walking wounded to move farther along the healing path of forgiveness, and that's good for America's collective soul. That's the second objective.
Well, I think we've reached the point of no return here. My apologies to all the writers of good questions. Wish we had time for them all. I want to thank Mr. McNamara on my own personal behalf and on behalf of all our organizations for a very exciting and informative evening.
Thank you very much.